Hey everyone, it's Ryan. Before we start today's episode, we wanted to give a big shout out and thank you for everyone who tuned in to the formal launch of the Best Teacher I've Ever Had podcast. If you'd like to support the show, head on over to bestteacherpodcast.com. We have links for all of the content and a way to support the show through a podcast donation or subscription. For those who would like to contribute, we've provided a form. Please share with us your favorite memory about Mr. Aiken's classroom or another teacher that made an outsized impact on your life. We'd love to hear it and share about it firsthand on the podcast. Thanks again, everyone. Enjoy the episode. School. We've all been there. It's boring, mundane, repetitive, and most often not catered to how we learn best. But why does it have to be that way? It was always status quo until I met a teacher that would flip my experience on its head. Mr. Aikens. His class was different. He knew that students were capable of so much more than we had been given credit for. Topics were brought to life, and curiosity, discussion, debate turned his class into the best part of my day. I was tired of sharing stories about Mr. Aikens and the crucial impact it had on my love for learning, so I've decided to bring him to everyone. This is the Best Teacher I've Ever Had podcast. Hello, welcome back. Another episode. I'm Ryan. This is Eric, or as I refer to him on the podcast, the best teacher I've ever had. Eric, how's it going?
It's going well.
For those who didn't know, our first two original episodes had to be re-recorded. I was like, I shaved my beard for Halloween costumes, and I was like, oh, this will be interesting to see like where my beard either comes in or doesn't come in based off the episodes.
Surreal effect, yeah.
But then again, I can't grow real man's facial hair, so people are probably like, oh, I didn't even realize you were
part of the temporal anomaly that we're kind of stuck in with this media anyway. So
for those who didn't listen or are kind of listening for the first time, this is the Best Teacher I've Ever Had podcast. The premise is that Eric here, Mr. Aikens, is a dear friend and mentor and had an outsized impact on my life when it came to really what it meant to find kind of a love for learning at a time where it maybe wasn't the most important thing in my life during high school. And that kind of curiosity and ability to ask questions really kind of changed kind of the way I looked at what was traditionally kind of a pursuit of, enriching one's life through information, whether that's poetry or whether that's history, whether that's sports, whether that's entertainment, this idea of really kind of making the most. And so this podcast is dedicated around history, as well as really kind of diving into the things that are worth talking about. But today, we're starting somewhere a little bit different in the timeline of history. So we kind of talked about this in terms of where do we start a podcast that deals largely with history, knowing that you've got to pick a point in time. And obviously something that was maybe more important and relative to kind of how we look at the lens of, of history through an important kind of foundation. And we decided that the Greeks really kind of cannot be, forgotten in that conversation. I think your class, as part of, looking at AP European history specifically, the foundation was, yes, we're going to talk about Europe, but we need to know kind of where this all came from and where these influences.
If you think the turning point in modern European history, which of course includes the United States of America, or an outgrowth of the European expansion, imperialism, was the Renaissance, right? And which is the French word which means rebirth. And it was a rebirth of civilization. It was a rebirth of what well, Ryan, I think you know this, right? It was a rebirth of what civilization, really, in the 15th century, in the 1400s. And I'm not, again, this is putting you on the spot here a little bit. Was it a rebirth of the Egyptian civilization? Was it a rebirth of the Chinese civilization or the Aztec?
I don't think they had some of those things in the Renaissance. I mean, it was Greece, right? It was Greece, right?
Yeah, well, Greek and Roman, right? Well, we'll call it the Greco-Roman. It was a rebirth because they went away. They went away for 1,000 years. Something happened to the Roman Empire in the 5th century AD, and it went bye-bye for 1,000 years. And Europe had to fend for itself. Historians have kind of come to a conclusion that, it wasn't such an abrupt rupture, that it just ended, and then there was this dark ages that was not civilized at all. And so... but it just depends on how you wish to look at it. But certainly something dramatic ended with the 5th century and the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And this Renaissance that occurred in the 15th century is the beginning of our civilization. We're still part of that Renaissance surge of civilization. of course, with all the technology that we have because of that rebirth that occurred. And so how can we talk about the rebirth without talking about the birth, the naissance, right? And the naissance was Greece. And it was Greece in a very specific time. It was the 5th century BC. So we're talking 2,500 years ago. That's the golden age of Athens, up at one city-state at that time, within about 500 various city-states. It ranged from 300 to 600, depending on which century we're talking about. Things change, right? History, the one constant about history must be change, as it is with the universe. And when we look back to the beginning of our civilization, the birth of what we consider to be a Western way of looking at things, as opposed to an Asian or an African or even a South American, which of course is now largely European because of European imperialism. But nonetheless, it's began with these Greek people. And so we have to look, first of all, what makes them different? Why do we begin with them? And also the Greeks themselves, actually, as a people and a civilization, began 1,000 years before the Golden Age. They began arguably 2000 BC. There were people what we would consider now to be Greek ethnicity, Greek ancestry, even Greek linguistically, although there was very different Greek that they were speaking 2000 BC in the Greek peninsula. Again, and I wish, maybe in this episode we can flash up a couple maps just to give people a sense. If you don't, if people out there can picture the Mediterranean basin, the Romans like to call it Mare Nostrum, our ocean or our sea, instead of the Mediterranean, which just means between worlds or between Earths, Africa on the south, Europe to the north. And from your point of view, right, if we're looking at it from your point of view, you've got Spain over here, and then you've got Italy coming down. And then there's Greece way over here in the east. And did I do that? Oh, no, I did it wrong. That's right. No, I think that's right. And I'm having to do a little mirror image there. So Greece is in the eastern Mediterranean. There's the Aegean Sea, which goes up between what we call Greece today and then what is called Turkey. And this civilization, I'll get in really briefly. We had two groups. There's the Minoans who were on the island of Crete. And that civilization was almost 2000 BC, so we're talking 4,000 years ago. The pyramids were built in Egypt in 2500 BC, 2,500 years before Jesus was born. So 4,500 years ago. So the Egyptians were cooking in Mesopotamia. What are some of the others? We've talked about this, you and I off and on. And we're beginning with the Greeks. What were some of the other ancient civilizations that preceded the Greeks? Because I'm starting to use these bizarre names like Mycenaean and Minoan, and most people have never heard of them. Yeah,
I mean, Egyptian, right? And then Eastern, obviously, you had, Asian and India, I think, obviously, players.
Yeah. And then we have China, of course, in the Far Eastern. Yeah, it's intriguing. It's all about 3000 BC. And in 3000 BC, in China, in the Indus River Valley, in what is now India, in Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates, in the Sumerian civilization, and then in Egypt, you had literate civilizations that were creating cities, monuments, walls. They were domesticating animals and cultivating crops. And so these were bona fide civilizations that were, for whatever reason, for whatever coincidence, all began more or less at the same time. And they all gained literacy more or less at the same time. And so the Greek people were behind the times. They began a little bit later. The people who settled in what is now Greece, we'll call them the Mycenaeans because there was the largest city-state. It was, and they were kings, were called Mycenae. And then on the island of Crete were the Minoans. And this is where we get the story of the labyrinth, the Minotaur and the labyrinth, because the palace of King Minos, and that's where we get the Minotaurs named after King Minos. It was so involved and so convoluted that later people saw it kind of as a labyrinth. And so we get the mythology of Theseus going through with the golden thread, trying to rescue Greek children in Ariadne and others from this terrible Minotaur, half bull, half man creature that was in the labyrinth, and Icarus and Daedalus with their wings fleeing the labyrinth. And these are mythologies connected with real things that exist on the island of Crete. And this Minoan civilization, it was doing its civilized thing from about 1800 BC, before Christ, BCE, or before Common Era, is what historians say now, just because not all the world is Christian and adheres to the Christian calendar necessarily, though they all do. But nonetheless, we've changed the nomenclature just to take that into consideration. And the Minoan civilization, which is interesting, they had the script. They actually were a literate society as well. But what's intriguing is that they had, it's called linear A and linear B. And these are both examples of written language. So they are literate, but they actually were Greek languages. The Minoans were, so clearly what had happened is the Greeks had, these Mycenaean people had come down from Greece and had a huge impact on the Minoan civilization on the island of Crete, which is this little crescent, or actually not little, it's a very large island right at the bottom of the Aegean Sea in the Mediterranean.
Right.
And there was some terrible cataclysmic, probably earthquake on the island of Santorini, perhaps, and this tidal wave, a tsunami that helped destroy the city of Knossos, which was the capital of this Minoan civilization. And so it faded from the scene. The Mycenaeans went over and they conquered the city of Troy, which is a very famous, of course, Homer, 400 years after the event, wrote about it in the Iliad and the Odyssey, the two famous epic poems, which people still read to this day. And so these are big events. And what's intriguing is that this early Greek civilization, in this linear A language, for instance, we have the script. We can't decipher it yet. We do know that it is a Greek. It is a script, a Minoan script of a Greek language. Linear B, which is the second one, is also a Minoan script, which is very linear with a bunch of different lines representing syllables rather than random single sounds like an alphabet does. And the linear B language we know as well is Greek. And so the Greeks had that type of influence already on the Minoan civilization before it fell, about 1400 BC. The Greeks, this Mycenaean civilization, went on, and they had kings at that point.
Right.
And it went on for another 200-300 years. But then it too, around 1100, they had invasions from the north, from new people called the Dorics, which eventually became Greek. They were Greek themselves. They settled in what is now Sparta, what we call Sparta, the Peloponnesian Peninsula. But then there was this Dark Ages. They call it the Greek Dark Ages. And literacy went away. There was no travel. There was no trade. Basically, people just lived off the local land. And there was very little of the trappings of what we consider civilization. All of the things that had been constructed by both the Minoans and the Mycenaeans fell into ruin. And for 300-400 years then, the Greeks twiddled their thumbs. They were not very civilized at all. But in the year 800, which is about the time of the poet Homer, if he did exist, we're not really sure. There's no real evidence that he was, other than the two poems, epic
or he
poems.
Might be he may be more than one person, right? That's the other common kind of
right. And because there was this oral tradition. Whoever it was, they've always attributed to this poet named Homer, and for hundreds of years they would sing these poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, in the evening to entertain one another. And so this was the Greek Renaissance, about 800 BCE. And included in that, there was a guy named Hesiod. He wrote, he's the first one to really write extensively about the Greek gods, the Greek mythology, what we call the mythology now. And their civilization was reborn. The Olympics began in 776 BC. That's the beginning of the Greek calendar as well. So 776 BC is year one for the Greeks.
Right.
So if we're talking about the year 400 BC for the Greeks, Socrates was forced to commit suicide in 399 BC. So that would be the year 377, according to the Greek calendar.
Right.
And just to put things into perspective, they didn't know that there was going to be this carpenter guy born, in 4 BC, and he would become the son of God, or he was the son of God. And
right.
Well, and they had their own calendar.
And the Olympics, even in this case, it preceded the actual events of like the Battle of Marathon and the marathon.
By 300, almost 400 years, right? Yeah. So this is, 776 is a good, 300 years prior to the Golden Age of Athens.
Right.
And so these are all but the point being, the civilization was cooking again, and there was literacy, and it was a form. What had happened is that the Greek people, when trade began to come back, and the Greeks began to trade with the other civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean, they encountered a group of people called the Phoenicians on what is now Lebanon and Israel. on the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, and they had an alphabet, and so the Greeks borrowed the Phoenician alphabet for their own language.
Right.
And there actually were two different alphabets. They, for whatever reason, because the Greek people were very, like I said, there were 500 city-states. We'll say 500 for now, right? Okay, let's say in the year 700, there were 500 city-states. And so one group, 300 of them took one of the, used it for their Greek dialect. They used a version of the Phoenician alphabet. And then Athens and a whole bunch of others in the eastern part of Greece used another one. And so we got the birth of what, fortunately, it was an alphabet, which is with letters, individual symbols representing individual sounds. Mm-hmm. And the Western one, the one eventually went over into Italy and became the Roman alphabet, which is the one we use. We use, A, B, C, whatever. All the Western European countries which use that. Eastern European countries, including the Russians and of course the Czechs, and they use a version of the Greek alphabet. Alpha, omega, alpha, beta, gamma.
Yeah. These are things we're used to now with COVID, right? The Delta variant comes from.
But just it is intriguing, right? So this Greek alphabet, we'll call it the Greek alphabet now. Even though they were both Greek alphabets, the Roman alphabet really was a Greek alphabet. It just was one that the Greeks didn't use, and so we ended up using the Roman alphabet and the Roman symbols and the Eastern Mediterranean, including, of course, those civilizations really affected, influenced by the Greeks, by what became the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire. They adapted a version of the Greek alphabet, and that's why the Russian alphabet is so different. Cyrillic alphabet is so different than. So let's what happened. There were so Athens began to emerge at this point. 650 BC comes around. And the Greeks are beginning to change. And so this gets to the question, why do we start with the Greeks, right? What is so different about the Greek civilization that we don't consider to be the birth of our world civilization, our Western civilization, that is the European influenced one, to be the Egyptians or the Mesopotamian or any of the other civilizations, Assyrian, Persian, Hittites that existed before or even at the same time as the Greeks? And the answer is pretty simple, actually. Every civilization prior to the Greeks, and even many, dozens, if not hundreds, I guess you could say easily hundreds, perhaps thousands around the world, would look at the world and see things that happen, thunderstorms and the seasons, and why does the sun rise in the morning and set in the evening? Why does it set so early in the winter and rise so late in the winter? Why does it set so late in the summer and rise so early in the summer? And it happens, this cycle, right? Why is grass green? Why does salt water kill plants and fresh water not? And they always their answer was always supernatural. These are things that the gods have created. This is the way the gods, and you have to make sure that the gods are friendly to you. And so human sacrifice was done, and these basically working out an agreement, trying to somehow appease the gods and make them happy to make sure that the sun will come back in the spring. Right. The planting will work, and that you reap your crops and you harvest your crops in the fall. And so these were, and we know all the stories. We've heard about the human sacrifices and all what we would consider superstition. The Greeks, for really a complicated array of reasons, believed that it was natural causes, that things happened a certain way in the world, not because the gods made them so, but because it was natural or physical, that the universe, the world, was a physical functioning organism. And this was completely unique. And this is what, of course, established in the Renaissance the Western worldview as well, which led to science and technology and industry and everything that we consider to be the trappings of the West, as opposed to the rest of the world, really, which we then introduced.
The Greeks still, I got a question for you on this.
Sure.
So the Greeks still had lots of gods, and very specifically for things like, Ares, right, god of war, and I'm sure there's gods of harvest. So
Aphrodite
how was that balanced? There's still, I guess, there was still a reference of these things have impact in these areas, but it's just that they weren't completely fundamental to how they worked.
And you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they're constantly intervening, right? But one thing is first of all, that these Greek gods were very human, weren't they? Mm-hmm. Anthropomorphic, and they behaved just the way humans behave, just as badly or even more badly than humans. And so the Greeks themselves, it was not an organized religion as much as it was a mythology. a belief system. They didn't go to church. There were no church services that they went to. They would go to festivals, to the temples, and they would watch the sacrifices. And a really fascinating difference about the Greek civilization is that there was no priestly caste. Every other civilization, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamia, all the different civilizations that came out of Mesopotamia, they all had a very important priest caste because they all believed absolutely and divinely that that everything that happened according to the will of the gods. Mm-hmm. And so there had to be these people who interpreted, of course, were intermediaries between human beings and the gods.
Right.
And they worked very closely with these priest kings who basically dominated all these civilizations prior to the Greeks, where the kings, the pharaohs, the sultans, whatever you want to call them, the shahs, they were all considered to be divine, connected with the gods themselves. And so there was a warrior caste in virtually all of those civilizations, and there was this priestly caste. And you had priests in Greece, of course, but they had no political power. They had no political role. They were in their temples waiting for, they had dozens upon dozens of holy festivals throughout the year. And it was this is one of the reasons why we think the Greeks developed a very independent mindset, where they celebrated the value of the individual, mm-hmm. as opposed to the collective at the mercy of the gods. They also, topographically or geographically, the Greek city-states developed independently, largely because of the geography of Greece, which is a lot of different canyons. It's very mountainous, and they have these different valleys. And so these different city-states would, in a river valley, their own river valley, develop their city and cultivate their crops, and they were independent. So that's why you had hundreds of different Greek city-states. But it was intriguing. After the 8th century, after this Greek Renaissance happened with Homer and the Olympic Games, there was this Hellenic, the Greeks they called Greece Hellas. They called the area Hellenic, or they were Hellenes. And so a pan-Hellenic mindset is, even though they are independent city-states, there is this overarching Greek civilization. They have the same gods, more or less the same language, the same written language that they used, the same customs. And so even though you would have Sparta and Corinth and Argos and Olympus, you in Athens, of course, and Milos and Thebes, all these different, very important, significant city-states, they had a lot in common. They all considered themselves to be Greek. Mm-hmm. And each one of them had very strong sense of their own sovereignty, their own autonomy within this. And also, I mentioned a warrior caste that existed in these other civilizations. And I can ask you this question. Again, I don't think it's going to catch you out necessarily, but for the city-states, let's say Athens, for instance, a city-state that had maybe 45,000 male citizens, had therefore about 50,000 women, and of course 100,000 slaves, let's say, so maybe 200,000 in the whole area that considered Athens, the greater Athens area. The walled city of Athens with all the agriculture and villages, of course, it surrounded that. So when Athens went to war, who were the warriors? Who fought for Athens?
Not the men from Athens.
What's that?
The Spartans in this case, probably, right? Or
no. The Spartans fought for Sparta. But for if Athens went to war against another Greek city-state, or if they went to war against a Persian colony, it was the people of Athens. It was the men of Athens who fought, and they called themselves the hoplites, and they developed a strategy called the Phalanx, which Alexander the Great used to great effect later on, where they would have the whole group would be shielded with the shields around them, and they would charge and be very mobile, and they were very effective. But that's an intriguing idea, isn't it? Where every citizen from the age of 16 to 60 in some cases would be marching off to war when war came. Now, what is that going to do for the sense of citizenship within a city-state? Are you going to consider that without a warrior caste, who fights for the city-state? Well, the people do. Mm-hmm. What's the Greek word for it? Again, we get to this word, the citizens, right? Mm-hmm. And the demos. The demos means the people or the masses of the city-state. And so we get the word, they began to have this sense that they have such a stake in their own city-state that they should rule their own city-state, that they should be in charge. And it just came around as a natural outgrowth of the fact that there was no priestly caste. They got their kings just kind of went away. They became redundant and superfluous. They began to appoint councils. They called them in Athens, they called them archons, and they tended to have 9 people in this executive council. And eventually the 9 archons headed up an assembly of 500 citizens. And the 500 citizens were elected or chosen by lot, which is incredible, isn't it, to think? So you'd have a lottery every 2 years, in some cases 1 year, depending on when we're talking about. And you would just draw names out of the citizens, and those people, every let's see, the 45,000 men, right? All of them would be, and they just pull the names out, and you could only serve twice.
That's like jury duty, right?
Yeah, they thought that was actually a better system than people voting in some ways, because they thought, well, everyone is educated, everyone is able to serve, everyone should. It's their civic duty to serve when they're called, because it takes you away from your job. It's not a great deal. They don't think it's a great gig. Like we do today, to be in Congress, they thought, oh, it was a chore. Yeah. So they basically, when their name was pulled out of the huge vat, right, that contained all the names of all the potential candidates for the Council of 500 in Athens, their name would come up and go, oh, okay, I'll do it for a year, 2 years at most. And then they only had to serve twice.
Yeah.
At the maximum.
Well, and I love that flip of kind of accountability is something that, I imagine, because you have such a direct correlation of impact as a citizen, you almost have this burden of kind of needing to be with it in terms of what's going on
absolutely,
politically and socially, as well as am I fit for war if a war came up. And so you change this aspect of, in today's world, we can talk about this more in terms of kind of the Greek democracy versus ours, but this idea of like, I represent as part of this unit of our city, and I'm crucial, and I cannot allow myself not to be, involved. Otherwise,
this is an American ideal, isn't it?
Yeah.
This is such an American idea that why do we have a public education? Why does every American citizen have a right, if not even an obligation, to be educated? And it's very much the same thing, isn't it? Because we should all be prepared to serve in the military if we have to. We should be able to serve our society, our nation. And of course, you need to have a certain level of education, preparedness in order to do so. And the Greek city-states had this sense. And of course, it is much easier to do it on a smaller scale,
right,
of a city, for example, a country like Switzerland, who was so wonderfully organized. And again, every Swiss male from the age of 18 until 65 was in the military. They serve 2 weeks, every year, and they run around the mountains. But they're all prepared if Switzerland, they always remain neutral since Napoleon conquered them. So for 200 years now, they've been able to remain neutral. But the city-states had that. And I'll throw a few names out there. There are names which are intriguing because prior to, in the 7th century BC, there was an Athenian lawmaker called Draco. And Draco, one of the things he did is he came up with, he had some pretty harsh laws. But he also, he gets a bad rap because we get the word draconian from the fact that his laws were so harsh. And so draconian measures are oftentimes very severe, very militant. Martinet measures, which is actually Martinet is named after a French general of the 17th century, means kind of the same thing, militaristic mindset. But Draco did make a distinction between voluntary murder and involuntary murder. Prior to that, if you killed somebody, eye for an eye, that's it. You were killed. But Draco actually was not so draconian. He said that there should be a distinction that if your cart, the donkey, whatever, or the mule, whatever's towing your cart, the rope breaks and your cart runs over somebody and kills them. It was an accident, right? So you should not have the same penalty as someone who did it deliberately, cut the rope so they could run over their neighbor with their cart.
Sure.
And, you have to prove the case either way. But anyway, Draco was famous, but nonetheless, he definitely was a tyrant. And there was a guy named Solon, who was incredibly important in the formation of Athenian democracy and the whole structure of its government and the way we think in terms. If you look at our government buildings to this day, they're shaped on the Greek and Roman model, right? When we think of law, of justice, of government, we think of the Roman and Greek architecture.
Yeah, I don't know if it's the same guy you're talking about, but I remember some of the harbor areas of Athens are grid layout, which is basically what New York took its model from in terms of the grid layout.
Yeah, that was after the Persian invasion, and that was when the Persians destroyed Athens completely. And so Athenians had a great leader named Themistocles, and he rebuilt the city of Athens, and then Pericles took over. And Pericles was the one who really laid out this grid pattern, a much more rational. This is the golden age, and we'll get there. And I'm nearly done with the setup towards that. We're getting there. We're getting to the 5th.
No, I just couldn't remember if it was that early.
Yeah, there were a lot, and there was another one named Cleisthenes, who set the stage for the invasion, to prepare Athens for the invasion of Persia. And so these were all events that, to the 5th century, the Golden Age. I'll set up the political first, because the Persian Wars are very, very important for Athens in particular. And when we're talking about Greek civilization, when you study them in your history of civilizations courses in college, you're studying Athenian civilization and the various thinkers who came out of the Golden Age of Athens in the 5th century BC, 2,500 years ago. And it just happened that in the 490s BC, 490 BC, and then again in 480 BC, the Persian Empire to the east. And by this time, by the 5th century BC, the Persian Empire included all of Turkey, all of the Middle East, and including the Egyptian Empire. They conquered the old footprint of the Egyptian Empire, going down all the way down the Nile River into Africa. And so this incredible empire, and this is where we get this story of 300, the movie 300. And in 490, the story of 300 is in 480. 490, the Persians under King Darius invade, because what had happened is that the Athenians had become so powerful and they become such a maritime or nautical power. They were establishing colonies all over the Aegean Sea, islands, hundreds of islands, of course, and then also along the western coast of what is now Turkey. And this was where they were encountering the Persians. Right. And they kept having these skirmishes, these battles with the Persians. Who's going to own these city-states, these very, very wealthy, affluent city-states along the west coast of what we call Turkey? And so it was inevitable there'd be a war, and the Persians got sick of it, and they thought these Greek city-states don't stand a chance, right? City-states of 50,000 people, or millions, tens of millions of people lived in the Persian Empire. And so King Darius invaded in 490 at the Battle of Marathon, 26 miles northeast of Athens. They met which was largely an Athenian-led alliance. And the Athenians defeated them. Their phalanxes with the hoplites, these are just the citizen soldiers of Athens and Corinth and Argos and the other city-states that joined them in the alliance. And they defeated the Persians.
And didn't the Persians even have they had Greek bought soldiers also fighting for them, right?
Yeah, and that was especially later on. That was more later on, particularly when Alexander the Great went east. Yeah, they hadn't really developed with the Greek, because they hadn't intermingled that much yet, where they had actually Greek soldiers. And the weapons, the Greeks had better weapons. They had gone through the Bronze Age and even into the Iron Age. And so they had iron weapons, iron tips, spears and shields coated in iron as well. And so they made mincemeat of this Persian army, and they went running back to Persia with their tail between their legs. Darius died 4 years later, and his son Xerxes decided that he's going to come back, by gum. And this is the invasion in 480, which is chronicled by the Greek historian Herodotus, the father of history, the first one who actually writes a history book. And it's the Persian Wars, and he wanted to. When Herodotus in the Golden Age of Athens, in let's say 470 to 460, is writing his book. He wanted to understand why the Persians invaded, why the Greek city-states, these small city-states, were able to defeat this incredible empire. So Herodotus traveled throughout he spent 2 decades traveling through the Eastern Mediterranean into Persia itself he wrote the entire history of Persia, of Egypt. This is why we know as much as we do about those civilizations, because he was trying to understand why the Greeks were so cool and how they were able to win, right? Just like America, right? How can we just win war after war? How is this even possible, right? These people, we're kind of soft. We like to do fun things. We don't, of course, it's changed a little bit. We have more of a militaristic mindset than we used to, probably, but nonetheless, it's intriguing looking at these historical corollaries, these things which really
it's almost like modern day journalism, right? How do you get the full story without kind of going into the other side?
No, and like I'm just, we started this all up. We're going to talk about the golden age of Athens, and here I'm going on now already for half an hour setting the stage. But it was very important what happened in the second invasion, and a lot of people I think know the story because of the movie 300. It's not entirely accurate.
Sure. You're saying there wasn't giant elephants, or
Xerxes? Wasn't 8 feet tall, and they didn't have a goat playing a harp and things of that sort.
Leonidas didn't have a Scottish accent. Is that what you're telling me?
Well, right. And what did he kick diplomats into a bottomless chasm either? And say, "This is Sparta. We're not Athens." The boy loving Athenians, and so that's those things. Who knows? He might have said that, but nonetheless. So again, they're coming. This time they're going to win, right? The Persians they've got, according to Herodotus, they had more than 1 million men involved in this invasion and thousands of ships. And how did they cross, the channel, the Bosporus between Asia and Europe? And they got the 1,000 ships and they lined them up, and then they put a big ramp across over the top. And so the 1 million men were able to march across the 1,000 ships, which were lined, in this isthmus between this canal that ran up into the Black Sea to the north. And so they come marching down, and they have to pass through an area which is only maybe a couple hundred yards wide, where there's a huge mountain on the west side, and then there's this cliff that falls into the ocean on the east side, and there's thermal vents at that place, and it's called Thermopylae, which just means gates of fire because of these thermal vents. And for 1 week, the Spartan-led coalition of about 2,000 Greek soldiers held off this army, which we now think was probably about 75 to 100,000, not 1.5 million, as Herodotus said. But nonetheless, that's an unbelievable military achievement for 1 week to hold off. And for 3 days, the Spartans, there were only 300 of them, held them off themselves. They told the rest of the alliance to go home. All right, we will do it. We'll hold them ourselves. 300 Spartans against 80 to 100,000 Persians, right? And for 3 days, the 300 Spartans were able to hold them off. And eventually they were betrayed by a Greek shepherd, as this legend goes, and the Persians were able to surround them from the back. But the significance of this is that they saved Athens. Not the city, but the people. Themistocles was able, because what he had done since the Battle of Marathon 10 years prior, when they defeated the Persians, he knew the Persians would come back. And he knew that Athens' military power was the sea. Mm-hmm. And so he built well over 200 ships, brand new ships called triremes, which would have 200 oars, paddles on either side, and were basically floating battering rams. And they could just smash into another ship and just rip them to shreds. And he had this done in this period, this decade, from the first Persian invasion to the second. And while the Spartans were holding off and sacrificing, and all of them died, including King Leonidas, while this was happening, the Athenians were able to basically move all of their people out to the islands to safety. The city was undefended. So the Persians eventually annihilate the Spartans. They come marching down into Athens. They find the city empty. So they burn the city, destroy the city. And they're sitting down there in what is now Athens. And they need to have their ships come down. They need their supplies because the Athenians had burnt all their food. They had taken all their food with them, of course, out to the islands. And so the Persian fleet was coming down, and they were tricked. There was Themistocles said he basically had a slave be captured, and the slave then told the Persians that if they come down through this one strait into this huge open water area just to the east of Athens, that they could catch the Athenian fleet and the Athenian people completely off guard. It was all just a scam on the part of Themistocles. And so the Persian fleet, which had all of their supplies, their horses, munitions, everything that they needed, came down, and then the Greek triremes came storming out of their hiding place and basically destroyed virtually every Persian ship.
And the ships are probably much less armed at this point because most of the men were, traveling on the land or some portion, right?
Yeah. And the Persian arms, and for the most part, they maybe had bronze-tipped weapons. They were bamboo. They were made out of wood. This worked great in Asia Minor, but not so well against an Iron Age civilization. And so this Persian army now is stranded there, including Xerxes, the emperor, Xerxes eventually gets on a ship and goes back to Persia, leaves his army stranded like Napoleon did much later. And that's all entirely different story. Napoleon had a reason. Xerxes didn't, other than to save himself. And within a year, then a big land battle was fought, and the Persians were defeated. And eventually, most of them found their way back home or were captured and slaughtered or enslaved by the Greeks. But the thing about this, the important significance for the Greeks and what this did for Athens, because you think, okay, Athens was destroyed. What are the Athenians going to do? Well, they're going to rebuild, right? And they happened at this point to have a leader called Pericles. And he had a vision for the greatest city, most beautiful, because this was very important to the Greeks, the aesthetics. Very much like what we consider the French to kind of be like today. The French have this love affair with beautiful things. They want their cities to be beautiful. They want their buildings to be beautiful. Their food displays, right? That's ballet, opera, all of that. And the Greeks, to them, culture, civilization was very important. And so it gave the Athenians a chance to rebuild their city. This is what they did. All the Greek city-states tended to would build the most important, the temple district and the government part, up in the highest part of their city, because it's very mountainous and rocky. And they would just call it the high city or the Acropolis. That's Greek for high city, acro. If you have fear of heights, you're acrophobic, right?
Yeah, that's right.
An acrobat is someone who's very good in high places. And the city was rebuilt, and they built a temple called the Parthenon up on the Acropolis, and they built the Erechtheum and dozens of temples, public buildings, the most magnificent city in some ways that people had ever seen. Fountains and the sculptures and statues, thousands of them up in the Acropolis, and this amazing laneway that wound up from the lower city, the marketplace, the agora, which was down below. And so this is the golden age under this leader for decades called Pericles. The golden age of Athens is also called the age of Pericles. And Pericles had these real strong, firm democratic values. He believed firmly in the idea that Athens needed to be a democracy ruled by the people, by the citizens of the city-state. Of course, women were not included, nor were slaves. So they were not that, as free-thinking as we would want them to be. But of course, we weren't either. Women didn't have the vote until 1920 in this country.
Question for you. So after the kind of the Greco-Persian Wars, one of the things that I remember is also that the city-states kind of more formally decided to, like, almost like an HOA, like decide to, okay, we want to support ourselves, from an army perspective, from a navy perspective. And like they formally decided to pay kind of, taxes into Athens to support kind of a common army. Is that true?
What the Athenians did because Athens was riding so high in the age of Pericles, is that they created this league, the Dalian League, and it was a league, intricate league of alliances of 150 different Greek city-states that were on their side. There were two powers in Greece. Two of the two greatest city-states were Athens and what we call Eastern Greece, and then in southwestern Greece was Sparta. Sparta, we could spend hours talking about Sparta. Everyone knows it's a military state from the age of 7. Every boy, we were talking about every Greek city-state that the men had to serve in the military. Well, Sparta was it was an armed military camp. And one of the reasons was that for every Spartan citizen, there were 10 slaves. And so if you could prove your Spartan ancestry, you were a Spartan. If you were a boy and you had no deformities. I think you know about the Spartan idea of exposure. A baby, if it was born and it seemed to be weak, if it seemed to have any kind of deformity, anything irregular at all, they would let it die of exposure.
That's right. Yeah,
they would leave it on the hillside.
Yeah.
And also then as kids grew up, and if they were weak and whiny, they weeded them out. They let them die. They encouraged other kids to beat them up and bully them. Kids had to leave their homes at the age of 7. Boys did, I should say. And they lived in the military barracks for the rest of their lives. When they got married at the age of 21 or in their 20s, they could have a separate household, of course, with lots of land for farming. They could go home at the age of 30. They could go and live in their house if they wished. But most Spartan men chose to remain in the barracks. They would go home, impregnate their wives, spend, a few minutes with their kids. And then they'd go back to the barracks and have fun with their comrades for the rest of the evening. And there's all sorts of stories about the training of the boys when they were young, the different heroic ends that they would go to not betray themselves. They were encouraged to steal things, to be cunning, to be sly. But if they were ever caught, they got whipped within an inch of their lives. Sometimes, of course, whipped to the death. This was Sparta. Even they discouraged trade. They didn't want to be like Athens. They didn't want to be a merchant city-state. And so Spartan money was lead. It was these huge pieces of lead that you'd carry with this basically a metal ring. And so, in other words, no one wanted Spartan money, and the Spartans. And no one, of course, the Spartans themselves didn't want to walk around with lots of money either. So it was just such a bizarre mindset. You have these polar opposite. Athens, who was celebrating everything that we consider to be cultured and sophisticated and refined, and as a basis, a foundation for a civilized society. And then you have this society, this other city-state, equally as powerful, which is only the military. It's entirely militaristic. And that's basically your only job in life, if you were a Spartan man, was to be in the military.
Yeah.
And the Spartan women were there to make sure that if the Spartan men came home from battle, that they either came home with their shields or they came home lying on top of their shield dead, that they did not come home without their shield.
Yeah, I think the Hollywood movie 300 does a lot of, ties to some of those legends, and stories and illustrations.
But it's hard to over-exaggerate. It's the most militaristic society that human beings have ever cooked up. Modern-day Prussia, which led into modern-day Germany, was very militaristic. We have certainly seen some in Asia, the Mongols under Genghis Khan. But these are different types of things. They were nomadic. Sparta is very unique. But so this is heading into the golden age of Athens under the age of Pericles. And I mentioned that Greek way of looking at it, of considering things to be natural causes rather than supernatural, that the gods don't make these things happen, but it's the earth is set up along natural forces. And so the Greeks, of course, then started to try to figure them out. And this is the biggest difference between them and everybody else. So since they believed that things were caused, that they were physical and not spiritual or not magical, and that they were natural and not supernatural, they said, we can understand this stuff. The mind of man can figure this out by examining and studying this physical world. And there was a Greek philosopher around 600 BC named Thales from an island called Miletus. And he began to say, yes, the world is physical and it's made up of a physical substance. And we can even figure out what exists. What is it that exists? What is the basis, the common bond of all things? And his answer was water. Now, his answer was wrong. But the significance is not that his answer was wrong, but it's the question that he asked. He asked, what exists? What is it that makes up the world around us? And he believed it was a physical phenomenon, not something supernatural or mystical or magical. And there was on that same island, another philosopher, Anaximander, who said it's called the boundless or matter, that everything is just stuff. It's matter. We'll call it that. He called it a Greek name, which is translated as the boundless or matter. Then there was a bloke named Pythagoras who thought that everything can be reduced to mathematics. And he's the famous Pythagorean equation about the hypotenuse, right? A squared plus b squared equals c squared. The square of the hypotenuse of a right triangle is equal to the sum of the square of the opposite two sides, right? And he also, he figured out the musical scale, the intervals in the musical scale, the octaves, the 12-note chromatic scale. He actually was intriguing. He believed that numbers had a mystical. So he's actually combining a little bit of the two, that things have both a mystical or supernatural and a natural.
He was edgy. A lot of people, he was the edgy philosopher.
Yeah. Then it's amazing, in the age of Pericles in the 5th century BC, we get a couple of guys in Athens, one of them from Abdera, and he moved to Athens, Democritus, and a buddy of his called Eusebus, and they said, everything is actually made up of something called atoms. Invisible little particles which cannot be separated. The Greek word for that which cannot be separated is atoma. And so they said that really the building blocks of all this stuff, this matter that Anaximander described, are invisible things. And they're these atoms, right? And of course, a lot of people, what are you even talking about? What's the point of this? This is nonsense. How can you ever even prove this, right? Because they didn't have the means yet. They didn't have the tools. They had the idea of the scientific method, but you can't prove that they're invisible particles, right, that are at the heart of all matter, which is incredible given the fact that we now know that they were right.
Right.
That they came up with atomic theory 2,500 years ago. And what we also got cooking then in this, so when they're building this Parthenon, and up on the Acropolis in Athens, and they're building this golden city, this city of marble, I should say, really more. But there was lots of, the Parthenon was painted in gold and blues and reds. The sculptures were as well, the hundreds of sculptures around the Parthenon, the roof, the pediment of the Parthenon. Inside was a 40-foot statue of Athena, who was the patron goddess of Athens. Makes sense, right? Named after her, the city-state is. And she too was painted. And the sacrifices, they didn't do the sacrifices inside the temple. They did it on the steps. They don't want to mess up get it all smoky. And, you get a big, huge bull up on your steps of your temple. You don't want to slaughter the bull and all the blood and smoke and everything inside and the smells.
And did the Parthenon also store money, right? Was there a treasury of sorts there too?
They had lots of gold. Yeah, they didn't tend to use lead as their money they had. Of course. The drachmas and denarii and the different words that they had for their money, and also were used later on by the Romans. They were made out of gold, silver, and copper. They tended, and of course, given the size, so a certain size of gold, that amount of gold was worth a certain amount, right? And so that's what basically gave the value, and that was the same way all the way up until the 19th century,
right?
Effectively, right? That if it has 2 ounces of gold, it's worth whatever 2 ounces of gold is worth at that given time. And so that was their money. They could coin. They knew how to mint coins. But more importantly than minting money, right? They were so, at this point after the Persian War, they were so confident. And they were building this glorious city around them. And they were putting into the Parthenon every notion of aesthetics that they possibly could, the golden ratio and these incredible proportions they put into the building. And that's why it's so significant. It's not nearly as large as the Roman buildings that came later or the Egyptian pyramids, or even the ziggurats in the Sumeria and the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. But it's the perfection of the Parthenon and these marvelous sculptures, which you can go see in London at this point, or into a private home in Scotland where the Earl of Elgin lives still to this day. But which, as you know, I've been to. Got to go to a wedding there, but that's a whole different story.
It's a sneak story for some premium stories.
Yeah, I think it wasn't common knowledge that they had not given all the Parthenon. If you don't, I'll make it really quick. In the early 1800s, we're talking about our 1800s, 200 years ago. The sculptures of the Parthenon were falling into disrepair. They were Greece was part of the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Ottoman Empire, and the Turks didn't care about the ancient Greek civilization in particular. And so an English lord named the Earl of Elgin, he's actually Scottish, got 26 ships together, and he loaded up all the sculptures from the Parthenon, those that the French had not already snatched, and he shipped them back to England. And they sold them to the British Museum, but the family also kept some, and they have them in their home in Scotland. And I got to see them, surprisingly, when I was at this wedding at that home. A manor house, this huge palace, bigger than the Downton Abbey palace.
Yeah, quite the debate on those that obviously the...
Yeah, see, and what Ryan's referring to is that the Greeks would like them back. And so that they can have them there at the Parthenon, or at least at the museum there in Athens at the foot of the Acropolis. And they're priceless, and there's hundreds of them in the British Museum in London. And the Brits are going, okay, do you have $100 billion to give us? Maybe we'll consider it. We save them. That's their point of view. And so that's a debate for the future. But not only do we have the brilliance being shown, of course, in architecture and in city planning, and in this system, democracy, the rule of the people, I mean, we can clearly see the foundation, right? Western civilization, no other civilization had ever come up with anything remotely like that. But we have philosophy, this Thales and Democritus, asking. We had this group called the Sophists, what they did is they began to scoff at these people who are asking, like Thales and Anaximander and Democritus are saying, what exists? Oh, invisible particles. Oh, thank you very much. That helps us a lot. And so the sophist, which just means, it's just the Greek philosophy, sophos, means wisdom. So they're called the wise men. And they began to teach people pragmatic ways to excel in Athenian life, to both in government and in the private sphere, to be able to use the art of rhetoric to convince people, to manipulate people. And this was the whole point of the sophists, was that they were going to teach the wealthy, affluent young men of Athens how to succeed and, as I said earlier, to excel in Athenian society and rise to the very top and be the most important people in the city, much like Pericles. So that was their goal. There was one man, a stonemason, born in 469, right in the heart of the age of Pericles, the Golden Age, and who fought in 4 different wars for Athens, named Socrates, who did not like this. And his main reason was because the sophists, they didn't really have any morality to what they were talking about. They said that those absolutes were something that who can really tell, that man is the measure of all things. And to say that these absolutes exist, they seem to be subjective, right? It's relative to a city. Look, Sparta has a whole set of different ideas of what is right and wrong than we do here in Athens. And you go up to Corinth or down to Corinth, and they too also have different notions. And the city-state of Thebes, very different ideas. And so it all just depends on time and place. And Socrates said, no, it does not. Right and wrong is set in stone. And these things are absolute. And so when you're teaching the young people of Athens, how do you even know you're teaching them what is true, what is right? Socrates himself, a lot of people, the Oracle of Delphi. Delphi is another city-state, and it celebrated the god Apollo, and was famous for these prophetesses, these priestesses, right, who would get into a trance, and then they would answer the question, and then a priest would interpret them. And one of the questions was, who's the wisest man in all of Greece? And it said Socrates, and Socrates says, wow, if I'm the wisest man in Greece, we're doomed, because the one thing I know is I don't know anything. And of course, people say, well, that's one of the indications of why he was so wise, because he admitted that he didn't have the answers, right? They're not easy. You have to work at them. You have to ask. You have to question things. And that's what he did. That's the Socratic method. He would, the Protagoras, I think I may in a later episode have told this story. But a sophist, here's a sophist at work. This rich dad has his 16-year-old son, and Protagoras, a sophist, says, the most famous of them, and he says, yeah, I'll teach your son how to be a great lawyer, a great politician. In fact, you won't even have to pay me when it came time to talk about his fee. You won't have to pay me a cent until he wins, your son wins his first case in court. That way he'll prove he's a great lawyer, and he'll be speaking before a jury, and he actually convinces them that his clients and he himself are right. And so the dad and the son go, yeah, that sounds cool. We don't have to pay you anything. This will go on for years, right? This education. So the next day, Protagoras went down to the temple, to the courthouse, and sued the father for his fee. And the trick, of course, being it's very the sophist. We have the word sophistry that comes from this, where you sort of manipulate the truth to arrive at a false conclusion. Because Protagoras, if he were to win his suit, he would get the money from the father, the agreed upon sum. And if he were to lose it, the son would win his first case in court. And so Protagoras would be paid as well. And this was actually just a lesson to kind of show the type of thing. And then Socrates said, this is abominable. This is ignominious to have this kind of, ethics being batted about as the way people should operate and function in Athens. And so he spent his life, decades, going around, basically collar these most important people in Athens and ask them about why they believed what they believed. He said that the way you can get to the truth is by, first of all, examining yourself, examining your motives. He said that you have to know thyself. That's the first thing. The unexamined life, if you don't examine your life, is just not worth living. What's the point if you don't think about why you're doing what you're doing? How do you know it's the right thing to do? The sophists, he said, don't even care if it's the right thing to do, as long as it makes you richer and more important and more powerful. And Socrates says this is inexcusable because these things are set in stone. As a stonemason, he of course would think that.
That's some great puns.
That these absolutes, right and wrong, good and evil, what is beautiful, what is ugly, these things are not subject to debate. And he said, that's why the Parthenon is beautiful. We could have made it ugly, right? But it's beautiful because we know how to do so, how to create beautiful things.
Yeah, and it's funny, that story, because by making everything subjective, it makes it impossible for them to corner into showing that they actually don't know what they're talking about, or proving that their guile and their deception. And so we have, it's just, as you told that story, I can think of so many modern day predatory sales tactics that are not too dissimilar from those sophists of old. And people say, oh well, this is, it's foolproof. The way it's set up, there's no way I can lose. And yet, those commonly behind it are very similar in that way, where their intention is really to either enlarge their own purse or those of others, but there's no other kind of morality.
Well, you look at movies like Wall Street or The Wolf of Wall Street, or dozens upon dozens, and it shows this. For the most part, I think most Americans have the ideal, like Socrates, that education should be something that leads us towards the truth, towards what is really right and wrong. But also, we have this idea that education, by gum, if you go to Harvard, you better be getting a great job that pays $500,000 a year when you get out. That for a lot of Americans, the goal is to excel in business, to become affluent, prosperous, to get It's a little bit of a perversion of the American dream, the white picket fence, the beautiful house, because most people have more humble aspirations. But there is this sense too, this belief that a cool thing about America is that we all can be the next Bill Gates, which is a great thing in many ways, right? Because it's that type of a land of opportunity. But we also agree that an obsession with wealth, with acquisition, with power, perhaps isn't quite so wonderful after all. It'd be interesting to see what Socrates would do with something like President Trump or President Clinton, people who clearly have demonstrated that they have struggled with certain aspects of their life in trying to figure out how to live the proper way in this world. How should we then live, right? And Socrates would love to be able to question our leaders today and to maybe show them the error of their ways. And that's what he did.
Yeah, and I think...
go ahead.
The quantitative, I think the aspect of that is challenging because there are very few things that you can evaluate on a quantitative basis to say, are you successful? And the things oftentimes that are most meaningful, family and joy and well-being, are very challenging on a scale to say, hey, this is my happiness level by all the things that aren't money. And so, they've done these studies.
So you got 1.5 million. Is that really enough?
Yeah.
Don't you need 2.5? It is difficult, isn't it? Because we start putting things in those, we start measuring. Measuring happiness, measuring the American dream. Yeah,
and they do these studies where they say, the diminishing return once you get past a certain amount of your basic needs and bills and things that you don't want to have to worry about, that it drops off drastically. And so to the point of your wealth is in perspective or in contrast to someone, but there's always going to be someone else who's higher. And so it's this never-ending cycle. Right. And so it's this interesting.
Keep up with the Joneses.
Yeah, I love that. I love that point, and just the fact of these great thinkers and philosophers of old. The reason that they're so prolific even in our education is because they were asking the questions that still matter today. Right. Are you examining yourself or not?
These are our questions, right? We recognize ourselves in them, and let's expand a little bit. First of all, the answer to this. Did Socrates write these down? How do we know about what he was questioning? We have 35 dialogues where Socrates is the protagonist, and he's actually asking these people, the leaders of Athens, these questions and showing them the error of their ways, that what they thought that their motivations were, in fact, were not, and that their foundation of their belief system was flawed. And that usually, of course, at the end, more often than not, the target of Socrates would come around and go, "Oh, thank you very much, Socrates. You showed me the error of my ways." But Socrates didn't write these down. Who did write these down?
I think it was his first Instagram follower. I think that was
exactly. It was
Plato,
right? He spent a lot of time with his phone. And he had Instagram and Facebook.
Yeah, his content was just amazing.
Well, Meta, we should call it now, I suppose, right?
Yeah, Plato, right? Plato was
his most famous student was Plato. And Plato himself, of course, became one of the most important philosophers, along with Plato's famous student, Aristotle. And so we've got we've got the science going on during the golden age of, science to the point where they can build the Acropolis and the Parthenon and this city, this glorious city of marble, and the wall that went around 11 miles around the city, and the great ports and all the ships that they, for their colonies. And they also have, as I said, philosophy, which comes with Plato as well. There was also another way to explore what is right and wrong. A fantastic, original, my goodness, magnificent way to delve into this is drama. The Greeks invented drama as we know it, literature. They had poetry already. They had Homer, right, who had written these epic poems. But who wants to sit around for 5 hours nowadays and listen to an epic poem be read or sung to us? And so thankfully for our entertainment purposes, especially in the evening, I suppose, the Greeks developed drama, tragedy and comedy. The tragedy comes out of actually the religious festivals where they would be recounting some myth, and they would have a choir up on stage singing, much like churches do today, singing the story, the religious or mythical story. And then you would have actors acting out the story that is being recounted by the choir. And eventually these characters began to have speaking parts. And then at the end of these dramas, whether it was Antigone or Oedipus Rex or a story of the Trojan War or of Achilles or the gods themselves, Hercules and Ares and Aphrodite, Apollo and all the different crazy shenanigans that those Greek gods got up to. Zeus, of course, turning himself into a swan and into a shower of golden rain so he could mate with mortal women. These wonderful Greek gods. Why did they ever stop believing in them? I can't imagine why. So these wonderful stories then were being recounted on festival days. And the actors, of course, began to take more and more a larger role. And this is the birth. And most of the stories ended pretty tragically with the death of one of the heroes. And so we have tragedy. And it's interesting because at the end of these performances, they would then sacrifice a goat to whichever god, whichever festival, whichever temple they happened to be at. And tragedy or tragedy means goat song, because the choir would be singing the song, and then it culminates, the climax would be the sacrifice of the goat to appease the god in question or goddess. And so it's just so wonderful when someone says, "Whoa, man, that's so tragic." And they're basically just saying, "Whoa, that's so goat song, what you just did, dude. Whoa, it's really goat song."
Maybe we should start
That's
ending
what
our
tragic means. It means
maybe we
goat
should
song.
start ending our modern tragedy movies with some goat sacrifice.
Yeah, exactly. I think so too. At home, why not? And you could just, the idea was to eat the goat afterwards. And then comedy, they would have these festivals. They would have 3 tragedies and usually a comedy that would go along with it. And so you have the Greek tragedians, the famous ones, Aeschylus and his, they would usually write the tragedies in a trilogy. And one of the most famous one that we have, the only one that we have, which is extant really, is the Aristotelian trilogy, which is based on the Trojan War, Agamemnon and the son Orestes and the sacrifice of Iphigenia. And the fact that, there's 3 plays. This is Aeschylus. And then we have Sophocles, who wrote the great story about Oedipus Rex. Oedipus, who is someone actually, Oedipus's father, went to the oracle at Delphi and was told that his son would be born and would grow up to murder him and then marry his wife, the mother of this baby, right?
Right.
And so when Oedipus was born, his father took him and left him to be exposed, like the Spartans would do with their children. They weren't up to snuff. But a shepherd from a different city-state found Oedipus and raised Oedipus to a strapping young lad. So Oedipus went out to make his way in the world, and he comes up to this crossroads, and this real jerk of a man was sitting there, and they got into this huge brouhaha at the crossroads there in ancient Greece, and Oedipus ends up killing this guy. And the guy was about maybe, 18 years older than Oedipus was. And he was burly too, like Oedipus, a stud. But Oedipus then wanders around for a while longer, solves the riddle of the Sphinx, and ends up going to the city Thebes. And Thebes was a city that needed someone with the vision of Oedipus. And so Oedipus steps in and he begins resolving a lot of the civic problems the city of Thebes is having. And he ends up naturally marrying the queen. The queen because the king of Thebes had disappeared for years. He'd been gone. So Oedipus ends up marrying Jocasta, the queen, and they have some children. 3 different children, I believe it is. And then things begin to go terribly wrong in Thebes. And this is what's interesting, because this is the way the play begins. It begins in the middle of things, in medias res, as the Romans would later say in Latin. In the middle of things is what that means, that you want to begin a drama in the middle of things, and then you go flashback time, like Casablanca does, right? Flashback. And so the story Oedipus Rex begins with Thebes having a terrible plague and all sorts of problems, locusts and whatever you will, right? And biblical type level of horrible problems assailing the city-state of Thebes. And they're trying to investigate why this is. They know that the gods are mad at them. And as they begin to delve into it and investigate, of course, they uncover the tragedy of what Oedipus did. That he had unknowingly killed his father, married his mother, and had children with his mother. So his daughter Antigone is also his sister. And so when they find this out, when the wise man, and when they get it, the whole story comes out. Jocasta, the queen, she hangs herself. Oedipus finds his mother, wife, hanging there, dangling from the rafter. He grabs the brooches from her cloak and he stabs them into his eyes so he could never see his children or his dead wife, sister again, or mother, wife, mother again.
Yeah.
And so then he wanders the countryside, a blind beggar, poor Oedipus. And then there's the story of Antigone is equally powerful. And these are stories which resonate so powerfully with the world today. The story of right and wrong and just the unjust nature of the universe and how do these things even happen?
Yeah, I think even a lot of those opening scenes from Oedipus Rex are used in the beginning of the Disney Hercules. Like they use a lot of that aspect.
Star Wars too. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very much. I mean, these are archetypal stories, iconic, that resonate throughout Dune and Star Wars, and particularly, I guess we could say fantasy. But it's really even in the most mundane story, comedy of manners, or drama about a married couple, and the infidelities and problems and alcoholism. That these were all tapped by the Greeks 2,500 years ago. And they would have tremendous, people would go to see 3 plays a week or 4 plays a week. And this was their entertainment. And they had so much free time, leisure time. They were able to do this basically because of slavery, probably. But they were very wealthy, very civilized, very organized. And so they could afford to have sports, the Olympics, basically taking warfare and civilizing it to the level of games. Because, of course, so many of the events in the Olympics were more or less just preparation for warfare.
Yeah.
And we have the great Euripides was another tragic playwright, and he really got into the psychology of the characters, which was fascinating. Really, he's one that did Medea, that's Jason and Medea, Jason and the Argonauts, and he's looking for the golden fleece, and he marries this queen Medea, and they have children, and then basically Jason dumps her for a young princess from another land, and Medea, this amazing, intelligent, bursting with energy and vision, and she has no way she can get back at Jason, right? In a man's world, Jason can just dump her and choose a younger woman. And so the one thing that she knew would kill Jason, which would really hurt him, is that she takes their children and she murders them. That's his legacy. That's his future. So this is, I'm going to get you, Jason, by killing our children. And just, this is just, you're going, this is horrific stuff, but it's so dramatic and it's told in such a way with the choir basically serving as the narrator of the story, the way that we have a third person story with a narrator.
Yeah. And
you can go, of course, to Greece today and see these plays performed either in English or in the original Greek as well. And they're just soul-wrenching to watch them. Aristotle said when you watch a Greek tragedy, that basically you arrive at this point of catharsis where you kind of purge all these terrible feelings inside of you, basically out of pity for just what has happened to these people, and also this sense of compassion and empathy that this could be us.
Yeah.
The terror that, oh my goodness, there but for the grace of Zeus goes I. And so this was the definition of tragedy. You also have then comedies. Aristophanes writing these tremendous comedies. He had one where he made fun of Socrates. The Socrates is up in the clouds with the birds, cloud cuckoo land, talking, and the birds are the only ones who are listening to him because no one else wants to hear him rambling on all the time. Aristophanes wrote one of the great comedies of all time, Lysistrata, either pronunciation. that's because it's Greek and it's transliterated differently. Pronunciation is sometimes argued still to this day. But it was during the war that Athens inevitably had with Sparta. And it's an anti-war play. And in it, the women are getting, because the war goes on for 3 decades between Athens and Sparta. This is the second half of the 5th century. So we're talking about 431 to 404 BC. And it began right at the end of Pericles' reign, that Athens and Sparta eventually, of course, were going to come at cross purposes. This Cold War that they had had for decades eventually boiled over into a hot war. They didn't have nukes to prevent, and so they went to war.
Almost. They were talking about atoms, though, right? They were trying to split the
they could have, I suppose, if they just
Mm-hmm.
developed the reactors. They just haven't done with them not to do
so
that.
behind.
Yeah. So the notion of the play is that Lysistrata convinces the other women of Athens to withhold all sexual favors from the men until they stop this stupid war, because their husbands, their sons, even their fathers are being killed in this endless war. And then they convince the women of all the other Greek city-states, the other 400, 500 Greek city-states, to do it as well, to go on a sex strike. And we'll see, what are the men going to choose? Are they going to choose warfare and killing, or are they going to choose love and or whatever else you wish to call it? And it wasn't easy for the men. They enjoyed both. But in the end, the women held the trump card, and the men stopped the war. But in the real world, they didn't. In the real world, the war went on. But this is the type of thing that was going on it must have been mind-blowing to be in the house of Pericles in an evening for those few decades in the middle of the 5th century BC in Athens during the Golden Age. You would have had Socrates there talking about the nature of good and evil. You would have had a poet named Pindar who would have been reciting his latest odes. You would have other poets with their epic poems that they had written, redolent, of course, of the poetry and images of Homer's great epic poems. You would have had the music, of course, which we're not really sure because there was no musical notation which we can actually transcribe to the present. But we know the instruments, so we can basically infer what the music might have been like. Mm-hmm. And of course, you would have had the drama. There would have been performances going on. And just the nature of the dialogue, talking about atoms. What is it that exists? What is the nature? What is good and evil? How do we know when something is good or is wrong and right? So just, this society was one of the most probably enthralling and engaging worlds to ever have lived in that human beings have cooked up.
We've talked about this before, but the other thing that's so striking during this time is the population, the amount of outside, I call them outliers in terms of, science and math and philosophy and poetry. Yeah. Yet this population total is, a pool of what?
We're talking 75, 80,000 of the people who really are citizens. I mean, we live, I live in Spokane, you live in the greater Salt Lake City area. Both, we're talking about 500,000, 750,000. But, the city is not much larger. And yet, that Spokane is not going to be the source of a new renaissance. It is amazing, isn't it? And what's interesting, because the Renaissance, when it does happen in the 1400s, happens in a city-state, again, Florence, which is 75,000. About this, almost identical in size to Athens. And, we know, in fact, as a matter of fact, that in the next episode, we will go into Socrates and Plato and then Aristotle, those 3 great philosophers, into much more depth in the next episode. And so I don't really need to string that along. Needless to say, what happened is that Athens sadly lost the war to Sparta. I say that sadly because we value, of course, the values of Athens in the end.
Right.
We like culture, we like civilization, we like drama and philosophy and mathematics and science and the study of history. There was a historian who wrote about the Peloponnesian War, which Sparta was on a peninsula called the Peloponnesian Peninsula. And so the war is called the Peloponnesian War, the war between Athens and Sparta. And all of Greece was divided. Either you were a city-state that allied with Athens or you were on the side of the Spartans. And for 27 years, they went head-to-head. Athens made some terrible blunders to some of their colonies, particularly in southern Italy, and they lost a lot of their maritime power and wealth. And many, many times the Spartans were ready to sue for peace because the Athenians had more wealth. They had more power because of that wealth, their affluence. But the Athenians were too proud, too arrogant, and they wanted to have total victory, unconditional surrender by the Spartans, right? Wouldn't that be a glorious thing? It was dumb because they lost the war. They had a terrible government near the end, and Socrates was very, very critical of it. And because of that, eventually, Athens, after the war was over, they turned and blamed Socrates and said, it's your fault that we lost this war, you bloody fool. And so they put him on trial for treason. They said that he had corrupted the youth of Athens, that he was sacrilegious towards the gods of the city because he oftentimes referred to God rather than the gods.
Right.
And he was offered during the trial exile, and he refused it. He said, no. Instead of exile, I want you to give me a dinner in my honor and give me a laurel wreath, crown me with a laurel wreath. He says, and then we'll talk about me sticking around, right? And so he was doing this, basically saying, if you're going to kick me out, you're not going to have me choose exile. If you want to kick me out or put me to death, I'm not going to leave. You're stuck with me, or put me to death. Mm-hmm. And they said, okay. And they voted. It was very close. We have well over 500 people voting. Black ball for death, white ball for life. Socrates, it turned against him. He was forced to drink the cup of hemlock. We have the whole scene, the death of Socrates, written up by his pupil Plato. A number of his dialogues, in fact, refer to. Socrates says, don't worry, don't be sad. You're all sitting blubbering like, little Albanian schoolgirls. Stop it. Albania did exist. It was a kingdom called Epirus, which was just to the northwest of Greece at this time. And he said, I think I have a good, I've been looking for answers all my life, and I very well might find them, in the afterlife. And so I'm not worried. I'm not scared, so don't you be either. And so he drank the cup of hemlock, and he died, and Athens was never quite the same. That was 399 BC, which is, almost a perfect date, right? The golden age of Athens was really from 500 BC to 400 BC. And again, we have to count backwards because we're thinking in time. That's the way it's work. Right? 500 BC is 2,500 years ago. 400 BC is 2,400 years ago. Yeah. 399 BC is, well, you can do the math, right? Maybe you can't.
That math.
Well, it's 2,400.
And I think so.
And 20 years ago.
Yeah, and I think it's fitting in terms of, to your point of kind of ending that age and Socrates. I think this is an interesting, if you ask, was he unjustly put to death? Will you say he was given a proper vote, and able to argue in a term of, what we think would be a fair trial? But he also was I think what's really important about his character is he made his life about asking those questions and saying a society is better for having individuals like myself. And so the kind of option of being exiled or having to stop doing that in a place that obviously needs it, I think he just saw as it was betraying who he was and what he wanted. He knew
himself. He knew what he called himself the gadfly upon the rump politic, the body politic of Athens.
Yeah,
and
I think
you have this mule, right? And there's all these flies biting insects, and that's what he is.
Yeah,
he's this biting insect, this gadfly that is constantly irritating. He irritated a lot of people because they made them look like fools.
Yeah, and we're going to go into it in our next episode. We're going to spend some time specifically on Plato and Aristotle. Right. But I wonder. I think their impact, and I think the reason they are so influential is partly because of that legacy that he left and the way he did to actually make a staying point on those students that said, "Hey, this wasn't just somebody who came and gone and was kind of whiff-waffy. Like they were important." And his martyrdom was arguably part of that kind of cementing.
And also, Ryan, this sets up because we know again what episodes 3 and 4 are going to be, because we have this continuity, this continuum from Socrates to Plato. Plato has his student named Aristotle. Aristotle has a student who's not a philosopher, but a philosopher king named Alexander the Great. And really, in the end, so how does this Greek worldview, this Athenian golden age, in the end spread beyond Athens, right? This is a valid question. They were defeated by Sparta. So how do we claim that Athens is the golden age, the birth of civilization, Western civilization? Well, because in this line from Socrates down to Aristotle to Alexander the Great, we get to this man of the world, this very practical man who carves out an empire, right? And in this empire, he basically spreads this Greek culture, this Athenian golden age mindset with science and philosophy and literature and poetry and architecture and education, all of these tremendous values which are the bedrock of civilization as we know it. And he spread them through this huge world of the Middle East and North Africa, down, all the way to India. And he created hundreds of cities during his 13 years of conquest, Alexander the Great. And this is what, of course, spread this Greek way of looking at things, this Greek mindset. So when the Romans come along later, they find this world transfigured, transformed into a Greek, basically a Greek scion of the golden age of Athens, a world that thinks like the Greeks, that values the same things that the Greeks did. And they had established this tremendous city, Alexandria. Alexander named these cities after him oftentimes. And Alexandria at the mouth of the Nile in the old Egyptian civilization. And they had the great library there at Alexandria with 500,000, maybe even 1 million documents, parchment and papyrus documents that people from all over the world, the world at that time, the Mediterranean world, could come and study. And this world, after Alexander even died, we call it the Hellenistic world, the Greek world. That just means Greek, right? And so we're talking, he died in 323 BC. But for the next 120 some odd years until the Romans come and conquer it all, it's a tremendous civilization. And it's all comes out of this golden age of Pericles, the 5th century BC, the kind of thinking that was going on at the library in Alexandria, the museum, which they have next door. Museum was just the Temple of the Muses, but the museum is where they actually studied different artifacts and relics from the ancient world. They did mathematics and science. And as you know, and we'll talk about this in a later episode, and we can wrap this up now. Been going on a little bit too long. Sorry about that, folks. You can do a Porky Pig thing here at the end. But we have a guy named Aristarchus, one of the librarians there at Alexandria, and he figures out that the Earth revolves around the sun, and that the planets that they can see with the naked eye, Mercury, Venus, Saturn, and Jupiter and Mars, also all revolve. He even had the order of the planets. He figured out that they revolve around the sun. The Earth rotates on an axis. This is 2,250 years ago. There's another one who was a librarian at Alexandria, there at the mouth of the Nile, this tremendous city that Alexander the Great had built. And again, it was laid out on a grid pattern, very much like what Pericles had done in Athens and what American cities are done. And Hipparchus calculated a lunar month within a second. We have Eratosthenes who calculated, if he knew that the world was round, it wasn't flat. And they calculated using these shadows and the Pythagorean theorem and marching 100 miles south. Because they knew that on the summer solstice, on this given place in Egypt, further south of Alexandria, the sun shone straight down this well, and the sun would shine on the bottom of a well. And so they did this, they extrapolated the mathematics then, and he divined and inferred the circumference of the Earth, and he was only off by 300 miles. 25,000, and it depends because it's an ellipse, it's not perfectly round. But around the equator, it's about 25,300 and change, right? And he was only 300 miles off. Because he thought it was a round sphere. So we have these people that came out, and there's Euclid, the father of geometry. It's if you study geometry to this day, you're studying Euclidean geometry up to a certain point, and then you go into non-Euclidean geometry and quantum mechanics and other things as well. And then, of course, the greatest of this Hellenistic period, a Greek, was Archimedes. He's one of the great mathematicians. He's up there with Newton and Einstein. Mm-hmm. And he's the one who calculated pi. He's the famous story where he's sitting in his bathtub and he figured out water displacement and how to measure the amount of gold in this one crown that this one king wanted to know about. And so when he figured that out, when he realized that, the volume of the body placed in the water displaces the same amount of water, of course, and it rises, by the same amount, the volume that the object placed in the water. And he jumped out of his bathtub naked in the Greek colony of Syracuse on the island of Sicily and runs through the streets of Syracuse shouting, Eureka, Eureka, which is Greek that I founded. Mm-hmm. So you have these fantastic stories, right? And this is all that Socratic thinking, this asking about the world. The world is a physical thing that human beings are motivated by all sorts, a panoply of different reasons. And that really, for them to have a proper life, they have to examine themselves. They have to think about why they're doing what they're doing, and they have to make darn sure they're doing the right thing. And this was really the heart and soul of civilization. And this is their legacy to us. This is what the Romans, when they conquered what was the Greek Hellenistic Empire, and they absorbed it into their own larger empire. This is the same mindset that they carried with them for the next 700 years. Mm-hmm. And of course, this is eventually becomes our legacy because of the Renaissance that happened in Italy in the 15th century.
Yeah, and I think this is why, we say, this episode, there's so much we could talk about that we haven't. It's so dense, right. And I think the problem is, what we wanted to lay down was an idea of everything to come is influenced and has foundations, and so many important people, and really just a confluence of places and people in the time. And because of that, the Greeks in our mind are extremely interesting and important because so much of this bleeds into what we know today. Our culture, like you said, is directly influenced from these people, right. These individuals. And I think as kind of a leaving note, I think the Socratic Method and really that theme of evaluating one's life and kind of being able to find purpose and meaning and make that individualistic and take that responsibility. There's so many great kind of comparisons to what the Greek citizens did in their kind of responsibility to uphold and to be a good member in all things. And I think that's where many of us are often looking for that value. And how do we quantify our life? And I would say, please look elsewhere. Please look at the things that can't be measured on your bank statement. And if we do that, I think we'll all be much more happy.
Yeah, you're very flattering in the title of this podcast, of course. And I like to think, hopefully, that's what I tried to achieve in the classroom, and that's why many students like yourself, for years, then later on, you said that the impact was still felt. And it's so bizarre because here in a podcast, I can't use the Socratic Method. I can't ask the people out there, of course, these various questions which might lead them, of course, to these answers. And because that's the basic way that I enjoy teaching history was through narrative, through stories, and then, of course, through questions, discussions, and getting the students themselves to ask questions, even perhaps deeper questions that probe further. Because as you said, there's so much we could be covering, but nonetheless, we just don't have enough time. And the podcast, it would really get deathly dull after a while.
Yeah, I would say
for 3 hours.
For those who are interested, I think that's the goal. We'd love to do more of that. I think there's a great opportunity for submitting questions, doing things that are a little bit outside the band of a story. Hopefully doing things like an AMA or something live that we can actually take in real questions and do some of that live. So let's remind everyone who's listening, we appreciate it, to support the podcast, bestteacherpodcast.com. We've got some great ways to find the episodes there, subscribe, put them into your podcast application of choice, as well as find ways to support the podcast if so interested. So again, this is all Greek to me, Eric. I'm Ryan. This is the Best Teacher I've Ever Had podcast.
Right. And so we'll sign off for this evening here where we are. So good night.
Thanks, everybody.
Phew.